This week we're introducing you to the term biodiversity, or the variety of living organisms in an area. Biodiversity is probably the most important term we're going to cover this semester, because we're going to use biodiversity as a way to measure the health of an ecosystem. Biodiversity helps to determine ecosystem resilience and ecosystem services. Ecosystem resilience is the ability of an ecosystem to respond and recover after a disturbance. So for example, after a forest fire, a more resilient ecosystem can bounce back more quickly than a less resilient or a more fragile ecosystem. Ecosystem services are simply the benefits that an ecosystem provides. This includes cycling matter, filtering out pollutants, and enabling reproduction and pollination in an area. Ecosystem services are vital and necessary for human needs. Without the services provided by an ecosystem, there can't be human populations or even human beings. Biodiversity comes from a combination of genetic diversity and biomass production. We've talked a lot about biomass production so far, and we've said that warm, wet, and sunny areas enable more plant biomass production, and that all other forms of biomass, be it animals or decomposers or anything else, ultimately depends on plant biomass production. Therefore, areas that enable more plant biomass production support greater levels of biodiversity. We haven't talked as much about genetic diversity so far. Briefly, we're going to run through all of the factors that enable a new species to emerge and ultimately allow a wide variety of species to exist. Inside the cells of all living organisms is a substance known as DNA. DNA is a macromolecule and is essentially the instructions for how your cell operates. More specifically, DNA contains genes. These are just sections of DNA that code for the assembly of proteins. Proteins are macromolecules that do the work of the cell. And proteins are made from amino acid molecules. So for example, this is a glycine molecule. Different kinds of amino acids, like glycine, can be assembled together in long chains to form a protein. The order in which amino acids are assembled determines the shape and the function of the protein. And then proteins ultimately give you the traits of an organism. So for example, whether or not you have brown or blue or green or black eyes depends on the genes that you have for the proteins that are found in your eyes. Different genes code for the assembly of different proteins. This is true for all traits in a living organism. All traits ultimately come back to the proteins found in that organism, which is based on how amino acids are assembled, which is determined by lengths of DNA called genes. Occasionally, DNA will have what we call a mutation, or a small change. A mutation changes the instructions encoded in that gene, which results in a different arrangement of amino acids, which results in a different protein. Usually, mutations are bad. Usually, mutations result in a dysfunctional or non-functional protein. However, every now and then a mutation can be good. Sometimes a mutation will create a protein that gives an organism a benefit in its environment. For example, vultures do not have feathers on their head because of a single mutation. That mutation was beneficial to that organism because it allowed them to feed on dead animals without having the dead animals stick to their head and getting them sick. However, if that bird were to be found in a colder climate, that would be a detrimental mutation because the bird would not be able to retain enough body heat. Mutations are usually bad, but occasionally mutations give a species an advantage. Whether a mutation is good or bad depends on natural selection. Essentially, natural selection is just whether or not a mutation is beneficial for an organism in a given environment. Over time, the combination of mutations through natural selection may enable a species to change over time. This is known as evolution, and this is where new species come from. Over time, new species can form as they accumulate more and more mutations, making them more and more different from the original organism. Over time, this leads to new species and eventually new categories of organisms. All biodiversity ultimately depends on whether or not new species can emerge in a given environment over a given amount of time and be supported by sufficient biomass production. If there is enough biomass production and sufficient genetic diversity for large amounts of biodiversity, then we'll have a resilient ecosystem that can provide large amounts of services that are necessary to support human needs and populations.